Hello, welcome back. A good rainy afternoon since it's been raining for the past few days. To everyone, I hope you're all doing well. For those reviewing for boards or whatever exams are upcoming whenever you're watching this, I wish you all the best. And of course, here to deliver quality, evidence-based, up-to-date information regarding drugs in however concisely I can package this. But compared to the psych playlists, the anti-epileptics won't be as long because, the perks of covering carbamazepine, lamotrigine, valproate, and mood stabilizers, and we covered gabapentin, pregabalin, and the bulk of benzos, basically, and sedative hypnotic. So there's a lot less to tackle here, basically, to avoid being redundant. If you've noticed, I have entitled this section, besides anti-epileptics, I do prefer a more mechanism-based classification, and that's why this is my proposal, at least, which will actually help you remember the MOA better. Technically, all of these drugs, basically, they do one of two things. Because when you talk about epilepsy, you talk about seizures, they're basically either enhance inhibition or reduce excitation. The thing with seizures is that there is abnormal electrical activity in the brain, and the drugs we have will either reduce that abnormal electrical activity. They will try to reduce that abnormal electrical activity by reducing excitation through blocking ion channels that would promote excitatory neurotransmission, or they would enhance inhibition, so promote inhibitory neurotransmitters, basically GABA, right? So GABA for inhibition, and so more GABA for inhibition, less of the others, basically for reducing excitation. But generally speaking, a huge chunk of our CNS ion channel binders will be just on the second bit, reducing excitation. The only mainstream GABA drugs that they really use for epilepsy are benzos, and fine, there's that barbiturate, but I'll get to that later. Why I sigh a lot when talking about that. But anyway, I mentioned the seizures here, and I think it's very important we get, let me just scroll myself down, updated about the new classification, new wording we use to describe seizures. First of all, what's the difference between seizures and epilepsy? In short, seizures are the, abnormal electrical activity, to put it shortly, and two or more unprovoked seizures, that's the epilepsy. And so you might be familiar with those terms. Generalized, focal. You notice here, in place of where partial used to be, we have focal. We no longer use partial. Okay, I know a lot of the older editions of books, I don't know even if the current ones, and even exams still use partial. Fine, remember those for the exams, but in actual practice, we now use focal. This is based on the International League Against Epilepsy, 2017. So this was 5 years ago. 5 years ago, they phased out partial because public acceptance, community understanding was not as solid. They wanted to be clear that when we said focal, we meant seizures originating from a specific part of the brain. So limited to one hemisphere, right? Because perhaps, maybe, I'm speculating here, maybe some people took partial to mean partial awareness. And awareness, in the old nomenclature, we used to use simple and complex, right? Simple, there was still some awareness, and complex, well, there was loss of awareness. But now, kind of simple and complex don't really tell you immediately what they mean. So now in the new, not new, it's kind of old. The old new classification, we just go straight to the point. Focal with awareness or focal without awareness. So now focal with awareness is what used to be called simple partial. And focal without awareness is what used to be called complex partial. Right. Distinct from the standard classifications, you have syndromes because there are certain cluster of signs and symptoms with a very defined cause, with a very clear prognosis, with a very clear manifestation that do not neatly fit into these categories. So epilepsy syndromes like Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, Dravet syndrome, and so on. Right. So those are your syndromes, which apparently they have a whole set of classification systems on their own, released just this year. So I'll leave that to you to go into. In terms of causes, so just really very, very quickly, when you say seizures, actually, just in general, there are many potential causes. Right? For some, it could be genetic, metabolic. A case combining the two would be phenylketonuria. An issue with a certain gene means issues with expression of an enzyme crucial to the conversion of phenylalanine to tyrosine, and that means that can lead to, well, seizures among other things. You also have structural infectious, so like lesions in the brain or meningitis, right? Or that definitely lead to seizures. So immune, this is there's been a lot more research in the past 3 years or so. Antibodies directly attacking, blocking the receptors, leading to neuropsychiatric signs and symptoms, one of which could be seizures, but some can also be psychosis, hallucinations, delusions. So it's not as simple as, okay, you have a seizure, give an antiepileptic. It could be an infection, it could be a lesion, right? So, now, of course, you could also do symptomatic treatment, but of course, it's important to understand the cause because the treatment approach could also differ. I will not go through all of these anymore, but I do recommend you go through these because people with epilepsy, even though epilepsy is a neurologic condition, people with epilepsy still experience a lot of stigma and discrimination. So it does help to be aware of how these manifest.